Sandoval County 911. What is the exact location of your emergency?
We think we found a body out here. It's in a road, and somebody had put it on like a mattress or something and burned it. And it looks like it has bones in it, and you can see intestines and guts, and I don't know.
The case I'm about to tell you is so twisted, it feels like something out of a nightmare. A devoted grandmother disappears without a trace. A frantic search leads investigators down a dark and disturbing path. And when the truth finally comes to light, it leaves an entire community in shock. This wasn't a random disappearance. Something far more sinister had taken place behind closed doors. A horrifying crime carried out with cold calculation, a betrayal so deep that even those closest to the victim struggled to believe it. The people she trusted the most weren't just keeping secrets. They were hiding something unthinkable. At the center of this mystery is Marilyn Gandert, a hard-working postal worker and a beloved grandmother who had spent her life dedicated to her family. She was known for her kindness, her generosity, and her unwavering support for those she loved. But somewhere along the way, something went terribly wrong. It all began in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a city filled with history, culture, and tight-knit neighborhoods where people looked out for one another. Marilyn had lived a simple yet fulfilling life working for the U.S. Postal Service for over 3 decades. She had raised a family, endured heartbreak, and always managed to find strength, even in the most difficult times. But in January 2018, something changed. Marilyn, a woman of routine, suddenly stopped showing up for work. Her phone went silent. Friends and family grew concerned. This wasn't like her. She was the type of person who never missed a shift, never failed to check in with loved ones. Days passed, and the worry only deepened. When police were finally called in, they approached the case like any other missing person investigation. They retraced Marilyn's last known steps, spoke to those closest to her, and tried to piece together where she might have gone. But the more they looked, the more things didn't add up. Stories began to contradict. Answers seemed rehearsed. And then, a chilling discovery changed everything. Something terrible had happened. Marilyn hadn't just vanished. She had been silenced. And as detectives began unraveling the truth, they realized this case wasn't just about a missing woman. It was about deception, greed, and a horrifying betrayal that no one saw coming. This is the tragic story of Marilyn Gandert. Marilyn Gandert had spent over 3 decades as a dedicated postal worker, a familiar and trusted presence in the Albuquerque community. At 65 years old, she was known not just for her reliability, but for the warmth she brought to her job. Colleagues admired her steady nature, describing her as someone who never let the weight of the world shake her. Residents along her mail route looked forward to her visits, sharing brief conversations that for some were the highlight of their day. Marilyn had a way of making people feel seen, a quality that extended far beyond her job. Her devotion to family was just as strong. Marilyn had always been close to her brother, Harry Gandert. The two shared a bond that had only grown stronger with time, leaning on each other through life's ups and downs. Marilyn's love wasn't limited to people. She had a soft spot for animals, often taking in strays or caring for the pets of friends when they needed help. Her greatest pride, though, was her son, Ryan Gandert. Marilyn had poured her heart into raising him, ensuring he had every opportunity for a good life. When Ryan met and married Alyssa Bickett, Marilyn welcomed her with open arms, thrilled to see her son building a family of his own. Ryan and Alyssa had 3 children together, and Marilyn adored them. She wanted them to have a secure home, so she allowed the family to live in a house she owned on Taylor Ridge Road. It was her way of making sure they had a stable foundation, a place where they could grow together. For a time, it seemed like everything had fallen into place. Ryan had a family of his own, and Marilyn, though still working, found joy in watching her grandchildren grow. She remained a constant presence in their lives, always ready to help when needed. But life has a way of throwing unexpected challenges. Ryan's passing shattered everything. It wasn't just the loss of a son, it was the unraveling of a future Marilyn had envisioned for her family. The details of his death were heartbreaking, leaving those who loved him struggling to make sense of the sudden absence. Marilyn grieved deeply. Though she did what she had always done, she carried on. She focused on her work, on her grandchildren, on the familiar routines that kept her moving forward. But no amount of structure could fill the void left by Ryan. There were moments when she found herself reaching for the phone to call him, only to remember he wouldn't answer. She poured herself into being there for his children, ensuring they still felt loved, still had a sense of stability. Yet, beneath the surface, things were beginning to change. The home Marilyn had provided out of love was no longer a source of comfort. It had become something else entirely. The weight of Ryan's absence had left fractures in the family, ones that would only deepen as time passed. And soon those fractures would lead to choices no one could take back. In the months following Ryan's passing, the weight of grief settled heavily over the household on Taylor Ridge Road. Marilyn Gandert, still struggling to come to terms with the loss of her only son, found herself navigating an increasingly strained relationship with her daughter-in-law, Alyssa Bickett. What had once been a family united by shared love and loss had started to feel like a battlefield, with Marilyn and Alyssa on opposite sides. At first, the tension between them was subtle. Unspoken grievances, long silences, and small passive-aggressive remarks that hinted at deeper resentment. But as time passed, those small moments grew into something much more volatile. Marilyn had always been generous with her family, providing them with a home and support. But she began to feel taken advantage of. The Taylor Ridge property was hers, and yet she found herself in an uncomfortable position, feeling like an outsider in a house she owned. Money became the root of the discord. Marilyn had allowed Alyssa and her grandchildren to stay in the home without much financial strain, but as months passed, she realized that Alyssa had stopped making any payments toward rent or utilities. At first, Marilyn was patient. She understood that losing Ryan had put Alyssa in a difficult position emotionally and financially. But as the unpaid months added up, patience gave way to frustration. Marilyn tried to address the issue calmly at first. She brought it up in conversation, suggesting that even small contributions toward the bills would help ease the burden. But Alyssa was evasive, offering excuses or changing the subject entirely. Marilyn began to notice other things. Money being spent on non-essentials, packages arriving at the house, signs that Alyssa wasn't as financially strained as she had claimed. What began as quiet concern quickly escalated into outright confrontation. Marilyn was not a woman who shied away from difficult conversations, and eventually she made her stance clear. If Alyssa couldn't contribute to the household, she would have to leave. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Alyssa felt blindsided, accusing Marilyn of trying to throw her and the children out in the wake of Ryan's death. She painted herself as a victim, telling friends and family that Marilyn was heartless, that she cared more about money than her own grandchildren's well-being. Marilyn, on the other hand, saw it differently. She had given Alyssa time, grace, and understanding, and in return, she felt disrespected and used. The once cordial relationship between the two women dissolved completely. They could no longer stand to be in the same room together. Every interaction was laced with bitterness. Every conversation, another battle in an ongoing war. The tension seeped into every corner of the house, affecting the children, who were caught between their grandmother and their mother. As the situation worsened, Marilyn made the painful decision to take legal action. She formally filed to have Alyssa evicted from the Taylor Ridge home, a move that sent shockwaves through the family. This was no longer just an argument. It was an all-out war. For Marilyn, the decision was about reclaiming control, about standing up for herself after months of being ignored and disrespected. For Alyssa, it was a betrayal, proof that she was being cast aside by the very woman who had once welcomed her into the family. The court process was slow, dragging out the tension even further. Marilyn continued to go to work every day, but the stress weighed on her. Those who knew her could see the toll it was taking. Her normally warm demeanor had dulled, replaced by exhaustion. She confided in friends and family about the situation, venting about the frustration and anger she felt. But even as she voiced her concerns, she never could have imagined just how far things would go. Because while Marilyn was focused on resolving things legally, something much darker was brewing beneath the surface. A resentment far deeper than she realized had taken root, and soon that resentment would erupt in a way that no one could have predicted. On the morning of January 26, 2018, Marilyn Gandert was expected to be at work just like she had been for the past 3 decades. She was reliable, the kind of person who never missed a shift without notifying someone, but that day, Marilyn never showed up. Her co-workers at the postal service noticed immediately. At first, they assumed she might have taken an unscheduled day off, maybe overwhelmed by the ongoing legal battle with her daughter-in-law. But as the hours stretched on, unease crept in. Marilyn always checked in. If she was sick, she would have called. If she had an emergency, she would have told someone. Her absence wasn't just unusual, it was alarming. When her best friend, Nancy, tried calling that afternoon, the phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. Marilyn had never ignored her calls before. By that evening, Nancy had tried several more times. No answer. At the same time, Marilyn's brother, Harry Gandert, was also growing anxious. He had spoken to her just a few days before, and while she had been frustrated with the eviction situation, she hadn't sounded like someone who would just up and leave. She had been determined to handle things the right way, through the courts. She wasn't the type to disappear without telling anyone. By the next morning, Marilyn's silence could no longer be brushed aside. Nancy decided to drive to her house, hoping she'd find Marilyn there with some simple explanation. Maybe she'd misplaced her phone, maybe she wasn't feeling well. But as Nancy pulled up to the home, dread tightened around her. The house was quiet. The mailbox was overflowing, something Marilyn never let happen. Nancy knocked, no answer. She called Marilyn's name. Still, nothing. Concern quickly turned into full-fledged panic. She called Harry, who immediately drove over. Together they searched for any sign of Marilyn, peering through the windows, checking around the yard. There was nothing. No clues. No explanation. Just an empty house that should not have been empty. By the afternoon of January 28, 2 full days after Marilyn was last seen, Harry and Nancy went to the Albuquerque Police Department and filed a missing persons report. The police took their concerns seriously. Marilyn was a 65-year-old woman, well respected in her community, with no history of vanishing without a trace. Officers began their investigation by retracing her last known movements. They contacted her co-workers, who confirmed that she had never arrived at work on the 26th. They checked her banking activity. No withdrawals, no purchases, nothing unusual. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. With no immediate leads, officers turned their attention to the most obvious place, the Taylor Ridge home. When they knocked on the door, Alyssa Bickett answered. By her side was her friend Annie Rael, a woman who had been staying at the house for some time. The officers asked if Marilyn had been there recently. Alyssa was quick to answer, no, she hadn't seen her mother-in-law in days. She spoke with an air of disinterest, as if the topic itself was an inconvenience. Still, the officers requested to take a look inside. Alyssa hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside, allowing them to enter. The house was tidy, almost too much so. There were no immediate signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood, nothing visibly out of place. But something about the atmosphere felt off. It was cold, sterile, devoid of the warmth of a home that had once belonged to Marilyn. One officer took note of a lingering chemical smell, but there was no clear source. It could have been cleaning products, but it was strong enough to warrant a second glance. They searched each room carefully, but Marilyn's belongings were nowhere to be found. It was as if she had never lived there at all. Despite the lack of immediate evidence, the officers couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Marilyn's sudden disappearance, coupled with the ongoing legal tension between her and Alyssa, painted an unsettling picture. But without a body, without any clear proof of wrongdoing, there was little they could do in that moment. Alyssa maintained her story. She had no idea where Marilyn was. With no solid leads, the officers left. But Marilyn's loved ones refused to sit back and wait. Nancy and Harry took to the streets, driving through Albuquerque, stopping at hospitals, shelters, anywhere they thought Marilyn might have ended up. They made calls, distributed flyers, and reached out to local news stations in hopes of spreading the word. Days turned into a week, and still, no sign of Marilyn. The weight of her absence pressed down on those who knew her best. Something had happened to her, that much was clear, but the answers remained just out of reach. And as the days passed, the cracks in Alisa's story would begin to show. The truth, no matter how carefully concealed, was on the verge of being uncovered. As the search for Marilyn Gandert stretched on, the weight of her absence grew heavier. Her family refused to believe she had simply walked away from her life. Marilyn was not someone who would vanish without a word, without a trace. Her brother Harry spent sleepless nights running through every possible scenario. Had she been kidnapped? Was she trapped somewhere waiting to be found? Or had the growing tension between her and Alisa reached a breaking point? The Albuquerque Police Department continued questioning those closest to Marilyn, particularly Alisa Bickett and Annie Rail. Their stories remained frustratingly consistent. Neither had seen Marilyn in days, and they had no idea where she could be. But something about their demeanor didn't sit right with detectives. Alisa wasn't distraught. She wasn't begging them to find her missing mother-in-law. She answered their questions with an unsettling calm, as if the entire ordeal was little more than an inconvenience. Days passed, and the case seemed to stall. But then, on the afternoon of January 27, 2018, an unexpected break came from an unlikely source. A group of ATV riders were exploring a rugged, desolate area in Rio Rancho, a quiet stretch of land about 20 miles from where Marilyn had last been seen. It was the kind of place where people dumped trash, abandoned stolen vehicles, somewhere you wouldn't go unless you had a reason. The riders weren't looking for anything in particular, but as they maneuvered their way through the uneven terrain, something caught their attention. At first, it looked like the remnants of a bonfire, scorched earth, charred debris, but as they got closer, an overwhelming sense of dread settled in. What they had stumbled upon was not a fire pit, it was something far worse. Lying in the dirt, surrounded by blackened patches of earth, were the remains of a human body. The sight was horrific. The body was so badly burned that any immediate identification was impossible. The smell of burned flesh and gasoline still lingered in the air, an unmistakable stench that sent the riders reeling. Shaken, they quickly called 911. Within minutes, Rio Rancho police arrived at the scene. Officers carefully examined the area, their faces grim as they assessed the brutality of what had been left behind. This was no accident. The body had been deliberately set on fire, an attempt to erase evidence, to make sure no one would ever be able to piece together what had happened. Crime scene investigators combed through the scorched ground, collecting fragments of evidence, melted fibers, remnants of what appeared to be clothing. The body itself bore clear signs of extreme violence. Even through the charring, the autopsy would later confirm what detectives already suspected. The victim had not died from the fire alone. Whoever had done this had made sure the victims suffered first. The remains were transported to the office of the medical investigator, where forensic experts began the painstaking process of identifying the victim. Given the extent of the burns, DNA testing was the only reliable method, but in the meantime, detectives had already begun making connections. A missing 65-year-old woman, last seen in Albuquerque. A body dumped and burned in a remote area just outside the city. It was a horrifying possibility, but deep down, the investigators already knew. Days later, the results came back. The remains belonged to Marilyn Gandert. The news sent a shockwave through her family and the community. Harry, who had held on to hope that his sister might be found alive, now faced the devastating truth. Marilyn had not only been murdered, she had been brutalized, discarded like she was nothing. The autopsy report painted a horrifying picture. Marilyn had been beaten, her body showing signs of blunt force trauma. She had been stabbed multiple times, and then, as if that wasn't enough, she had been set on fire in a cruel, calculated attempt to erase the evidence. Detectives now had a homicide investigation on their hands. And with that revelation, they turned their attention back to Alyssa Bickett and Annie Rail. Because if Marilyn's disappearance had already raised questions, her murder raised an entirely new set of them. Someone had wanted her dead. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure she would never come back. And someone, whether through silence or direct involvement, knew exactly how it had happened. The discovery of Marilyn Gandard's burned remains shattered any illusion that her disappearance had been a simple case of a woman walking away from her life. Someone had wanted her gone, and they had done everything in their power to make sure she would never return. But who and why? Detectives already had their suspicions. From the moment Marilyn was reported missing, Alyssa Bickett's behavior had raised eyebrows. She was unnervingly composed, her concern for her missing mother-in-law barely registering. Then there was Annie Rael, her closest friend and roommate, whose presence at the Taylor Ridge residence at the time of Marilyn's disappearance added another layer of suspicion. Yet, as investigators began to peel back the layers, what they found was even darker than they had anticipated. Marilyn hadn't been killed in a fit of blind rage. This wasn't an impulsive act of violence. It was planned. The motive, at its core, was as cold as it was calculated. Marilyn owned the house they lived in, and she wanted Alyssa out. Faced with the looming reality of eviction, financial ruin, and the uncertainty of what would happen to her and her children, Alyssa made a decision, one that crossed a line from which there was no return. She wouldn't let Marilyn take everything away from her. And she wouldn't do it alone. As detectives pieced together Marilyn's final moments, a horrifying timeline emerged. On the afternoon of January 24, 2018, Marilyn arrived at the Taylor Ridge home, possibly to confront Alyssa once again about the unpaid rent and the impending eviction, but this time she had no idea that her fate had already been sealed. Her grandson Drake Bickett had been chosen to play a key role. Only 18 years old, he was fiercely loyal to his mother, willing to do whatever it took to protect their way of life. Alyssa knew that, and she used it. Investigators believe Marilyn entered the house unaware of what awaited her inside. According to later testimonies and evidence, she had likely been lured there under the pretense of a conversation, perhaps a last-ditch effort by Alyssa to manipulate the situation, to convince Marilyn to change her mind. But there was never going to be a compromise. As Marilyn stepped inside, she was ambushed. Drake, lying in wait, attacked her with a knife. The assault was frenzied, brutal. Blood spattered across the room as Marilyn struggled, fighting to escape, to plead for her life. But she was overpowered. At some point, Annie Rail joined in, whether it was to help subdue Marilyn or to ensure that the attack was fatal. Her involvement was undeniable. When the struggle ended, Marilyn lay lifeless on the floor of the home she had once owned. But killing her wasn't enough. They had to get rid of the body. With Marilyn dead, panic set in, but only briefly. Alyssa had planned for this moment. The trio wrapped Marilyn's body in whatever they could find, determined to move her before anyone came looking. A car was prepared, and under the cover of darkness, they loaded her into the vehicle. They drove for miles, finally stopping in the desolate outskirts of Rio Rancho, far from the eyes of curious neighbors or potential witnesses. There, in the cold night air, they doused Marilyn's body in gasoline and set her ablaze. The fire roared, consuming flesh, clothing, and any trace of the brutal attack that had taken place inside the house. They stood there, watching as the flames reduced her to an unrecognizable state, ensuring that forensic evidence would be limited. When the fire burned down to embers, they left her there, discarded, as if her life had meant nothing. In the days that followed, Alyssa, Drake, and Annie attempted to go about their lives as if nothing had happened. But the cracks in their carefully constructed story began to form almost immediately. Alyssa's nonchalant attitude when Marilyn was reported missing had already raised suspicions. She didn't act like a grieving daughter-in-law. She didn't demand answers from the police or plead for the public's help. Instead, she carried herself with an unsettling indifference. Detectives noticed it, and they weren't the only ones. Harry Gandalf, Marilyn's brother, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Elisa's explanations didn't sit right with him. He pushed for answers. He demanded the police look closer. And then came the biggest crack in their story. Drake! Unlike his mother, Drake wasn't as composed. Friends and acquaintances would later reveal that in the days after Marilyn's disappearance, something about him seemed off. He was jumpy, nervous. It was as if he was carrying a weight too heavy for him to bear. Detectives, already circling the trio, turned their attention to him. The questions started simple. When was the last time he saw his grandmother? Did she say anything before she left? But then, the questions shifted. Did he know anything about her disappearance? Had he seen anything unusual that night? The pressure built. And soon, Drake's carefully rehearsed story began to crumble. One misstep, one contradiction, that was all it took. And once detectives had their first crack in the conspiracy, they wouldn't stop until they tore the entire lie apart. Drake Bickett, already struggling under the weight of guilt, was the first to break. It started with inconsistencies, details he forgot he had already altered, answers that contradicted statements he had given just days earlier. Detectives pressed harder, questioning him separately from his mother and Annie Rail, isolating him from the only people keeping the truth contained. The pressure was relentless, and then, in a moment of weakness, or perhaps a moment of conscience, Drake gave investigators exactly what they needed. A confession. The truth poured out, each word a chilling confirmation of what law enforcement had suspected all along. Marilyn Gandert had been lured to the home under false pretenses, attacked and brutally killed before her body was disposed of in a fire meant to erase all evidence of the crime. But even as Drake confessed, he minimized his own role. He claimed he had been manipulated by his mother, pushed into doing something he never would have considered on his own. With this admission, detectives moved swiftly. Arrest warrants were issued, and within days, Alyssa Bickett, Drake Bickett, and Annie Rail were in handcuffs. The courtroom became a battleground as prosecutors laid out every horrific detail of Marilyn's final moments. Evidence from the crime scene, witness testimonies, and Drake's own confession painted a picture of betrayal so profound that it left those in attendance horrified. Alyssa, the woman Marilyn had once trusted as family, showed no remorse. In her mind, she had been left with no choice. Eviction had meant ruin, and Marilyn had been the obstacle standing in her way. But the jury saw her for what she was. Not a desperate woman trying to survive, but a manipulator who had orchestrated a murder and convinced her own son to carry it out. Drake's defense tried to frame him as a victim of his mother's influence. They argued that, at just 18, he had been vulnerable, brainwashed into believing that this was his only option. While the court acknowledged his age and his mother's role in shaping his actions, the brutal nature of the crime could not be ignored. Annie Rael, who had tried to distance herself from the crime after the arrests, faced damning evidence of her involvement. Though she hadn't wielded the knife, she had been there. She had helped cover up the crime. She had remained silent when the world was searching for Marilyn. The jury deliberated for hours, but the outcome was clear. Alyssa Bickett was sentenced to 30 years in prison for second-degree murder and related charges. Drake Bickett, despite his cooperation, received 26 years, a heavy price to pay for following his mother down a path of no return. Annie Rael, for her role in covering up the crime, faced her own legal consequences, ensuring that no one involved in Marilyn's murder walked away unpunished. The murder of Marilyn Gandert left a wound in the community that would never fully heal. To those who had known her, she was more than just a victim. She was a mother, a sister, a friend. She had dedicated her life to her family, only to be betrayed in the most unimaginable way. Her brother Harry, who had tirelessly pushed for answers, stood in court on the day of sentencing, his voice steady but laced with grief. He spoke not just for himself but for Marilyn, for the years stolen from her, for the suffering she endured, for the justice she could no longer seek on her own. Marilyn didn't deserve this, he told the court. She deserved love. She deserved kindness. She deserved to grow old, surrounded by people who valued her, and instead, she was taken from us in a way that is beyond cruel. The community mourned her loss, grappling with the horror of a crime that had unfolded within their midst. It was a chilling reminder that the deepest betrayals often come not from strangers, but from those we trust the most. Marilyn Gandert's story is one of shocking betrayal, a devastating reminder of how greed and desperation can lead to the unthinkable. But now we want to hear from you. If you believe no one should ever meet such a fate at the hands of their own family, subscribe to the channel. Only those who think betrayal like this is acceptable wouldn't subscribe. And for those who want to see justice served in every case like Marilyn's, check out our other crime stories.